The chairperson, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, here virtually gathered, I am Professor Etienne Ehouan, Secretary General of the Association of African Universities, AAU. I stand on established protocols to send to all of you fraternal greeting of the Association of African Universities, the apex higher education organization in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, permit me to briefly introduce the Association of African Universities to the audience. The association is a higher education organization that was established in 1967 to promote inter-university cooperation and collaboration, and currently has over 400 universities and higher education institutions as members. The AAU supports higher education institutions in their core function and provides a continental platform for discussion of emerging issues that impinge on our development. Our members are spread across 46 countries on the continent. We, thus, work across all the political, geographical, and linguistic divides of Africa and operate in 4 languages, namely English, French, Arabic, and Portuguese. It is our wish to have all higher education institutions in Africa join the AAU to strengthen inter-university collaboration and cooperation on the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, back on the topic, reflection on decolonizing mind, my focus in the delivery will be on higher education. This perspective is based upon the fact that I represent a continental higher education organization. Ladies and gentlemen, I see colonization as the second form of undermining a people's sovereignty, next after slavery. Etymologically, to colonize is to appropriate a place or domain for one's own use. This is why decolonization is understood as the desire to regain independence or freedom from dominance. In other words, why, how, and under what condition can I truly become myself again without having to be the puppet of another person? Africa is evidently the original home of the human species and the cradle of civilization. Kemet, the popular ancient name of Egypt, or the Black Land, because of the fertile soil that the Nile produced, and Nubia up to part of Sudan, had advanced technological knowledge to build the pyramid 25 centuries before Christ was born. During that time, there were no Greek, no Roman empires. Historians allude that the first Greek philosophers may have all had some schooling in Africa. A century after the era of the known Greek philosophers Herodotus, Plato, Aristotle, Africa gave birth to the university concept as a community of scholars with an international outlook, even though long tradition of libraries existed in both Greece and in the ancient Near East. The famous museum and library built in the Egyptian city of Alexandria in the 3rd century before Christ became responsible for assembling more than 200,000 volumes of manuscripts of contemporary knowledge. It became acknowledged as the greatest cultural repository of its time. Battles of supremacy and expansion centuries ago saw different regions of Africa subdued by the Persians, the Greek, etc., and later by the Arab, Portuguese, Dutch, English, Belgian, French, and the German. The continent's greatest strength, its humaneness, identity, and hospitality were used against her. The conquerors brought along with them their religions, their cultures, their names, their languages, their thoughts, and their philosophies, and imposed these on the Africans. They also brought along and deepened divisions and inequalities with classifications such as European versus non-European, white versus native, national versus foreign, me versus other, Christian versus animist, urban versus rural, dominant versus dominated, etc. The African became a commodity, and his black body created wealth for the Caucasian and the Asian. His skin color became a definition of who has the power. He forgot what it was to be an African. Today, the African continent is still under European, North American, Russian, Chinese, Indian, and other influences in all spheres of human endeavor. Being thus overtly and covertly subdued psychologically, physically, culturally, ideologically, socially, economically, and religiously into adopting other worldviews as superiors to her. The African society has been indoctrinated to oppose her own traditional knowledge and science. According to Professor John Henry Clark, an African-American historian and a pioneer in the creation of Pan-African and African studies, to control a people, you must first control what they think about themselves and how they regard their history and culture. And when your conqueror makes you ashamed of your culture and your history, he needs no prison cells and no chance to hold you. In opposing the quest to establish African universities, seen by Africans as the means to erode centuries of ignorance and end all forms of discrimination, the Church Missionary Society, CMS, operating in West Africa, stated rather forcefully that Africa has no past. How? Then were race instincts to be respected, which either had no existence or which, if it existed at all, were fatal and soul destroying to the Negro. The loss of the African identity was further deepened by the colonial partitioning of Africa into English-speaking, French-speaking, Portuguese-speaking, Arabic-speaking, Spanish-speaking geographical enclaves that did not take into consideration the initial ethno-linguistic configuration of the affected peoples. The principal issue of the 21st century for the African is therefore the issue of identity. When you know who you are, it is hard for someone to oppress you. Ladies and gentlemen, the decolonization process begins with the mind, and the onus is on education. Our main challenge here in Africa is the Eurocentric educational system inherited from the colonial masters. Education is supposed to create wellness, content, and socialization, but this was narrowly used by the colonial administration to maintain law and order in the colonies, to facilitate commerce, and for missionary activities, particularly evangelization. With the growing demand for intermediaries to promote rapid evangelization, the missionary societies realized that it was cost-effective to train more African teachers and pastors locally than sending a limited few abroad at greater expense. The number of institutions of learning, therefore, grew rapidly, but hardly were the educational content used to foster social change, even in the French colonial administrations, where the official policy was one of assimilation and racial equality. Higher education, after the immediate post-independence era, was seen as a critical tool of social cohesion to give the African a true identity. Universities were also seen as symbols of national pride and sovereignty by the newly independent countries. The importance attached to the establishment is well summed up in the speech by the first president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, at the Chancellor's installation banquet on July 12, 1966, who said, and I quote, "We in Zambia are immensely proud of our university. The pride is not simply that this is our first and only university. It is also because the University of Zambia is our own university in a very real sense. The story of how the people of this country responded so enthusiastically to my appeal for support is a very thrilling one. Humble folk in every corner of our nation, illiterated villages, barefooted school children, prisoned inmates, and even lepers, gave freely and willingly everything they could, often in the form of fish or maize or chicken. The reason for this extraordinary response was that our people see in the university the hope of a better and fuller life for their children and grandchildren. The question, however, remains whether in our contemporary era there is a true African university, or what we have is a copy of European university. Who do we learn for? Or what are we taught? Does our education achieve any economic gains for our people? The rise in nationalism and Pan-Africanism in the 1920s, instigated by the likes of Marcus Garvey and of William Du Bois, led to the clamor for indigenous African universities whose degrees would have worldwide recognition and provide access for its holders into responsible decision-making posts in the civil service hitherto reserved for Europeans. The envisioned African university, as described by Casey Hayford, a graduate of Furabe College in Sierra Leone, in his 1911 book entitled Ethiopia Unbound, was a native Fanti university teaching in a native Fanti and making the development of African languages and cultures its major area of concern. Later generations of academics, such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Nami Azikiwe of Nigeria, who had been externally influenced by the educational reforms in Europe and America, were encouraged to keep up the call for a more secular African university based on race consciousness and regard for African culture and traditions. But the issue of race consciousness further begs the question on whether the African curriculum creates an environment of inquiry for this at all. Celebrated modern historians Molefi Kete-Asante, a professor at the Department of African American Studies at Temple University, USA, have queried why the curricula on philosophy, history, mathematics, etc., all start with the Greeks when Greek was established some 1000 before Christ, while there existed the Nubia and Kemet civilization in Africa several centuries earlier. He further questioned how one can erode the notion that the African has wisdom but no philosophy, the Asian have myths, the Native American has tales, and only Europe has philosophy. What about the notion that astrology, geometry, and medicine, for instance, started from Africa? Why do Europeans call African kings chiefs, but even the smallest of kings in Europe is still a king? Why transformative education requires that Africa needs to learn from good practices from anywhere in the world, has the African scientists ever concluded research on the pyramids of Egypt? What scientific inquiry has come into researching on the technological design of the Sombos Eredo Trench in Nigeria, a man-made trench built in 1800 to 1000 AD that may have taken more energies to build than even the pyramids. Who do we research for? What do we research for? And what do we research into? In essence, Molefi is emphasizing the need not to ignore or deny the history of Africa, but for Africans to channel their efforts into putting African people's interests at the center of all they do to overcome the challenges created by intellectual misalignment. As newly established African universities in the immediate post-colonial era began facilitating the Africanization process and establishing Institute of African Studies to give more attention to African languages and oral traditions, the formation of the Association of African Universities in 1967 reinvigorated the need and gave more impetus to the promotion of the African identity through inter-university cooperation and collaboration. Despite these concerted efforts, traces of the colonial legacy and imprints still exist in African universities. In mostly West and tropical Africa, where the colonial administration was solely responsible for financing education, this legacy has been most of a state-run and state-owned higher education institution, heavily dependent on state funding, both in terms of recurrent and capital budgetary allocations. The transitioning into entrepreneurial universities has become more Herculean for this establishment and still remains a novelty for many. Political interference, which were rife to assert the sovereignty of the newly independent state and as a means to control the institution into making them more responsive to development plans, has become a tool of oppression and suppression as evidenced under military regimes in Nigeria in 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, Burkina Faso in 1987, Niger in 1989, Zaire in 1992, Ivory Coast in 1992, and Kenya in 1992. The ivory tower concept is still a colonial legacy with the academic gown visibly seen as separate from town. The location of colonial university colleges had been mostly on the suburbs of existing urban centers, except for University of Nairobi, which was situated in the middle of town because it started as a college of technology, University of Lagos, University of Ibadan, University of Lovanium, University of Ghana, Makerere University, and the University of Dar es Salaam were all built away from the center of time. Discriminatory staff policies where remunerative packages, salaries, and living conditions are more generous for expatriates than for African staff are also a colonial legacy. But on the other hand, the post-independent government of Africa are beneficiaries of international technical assistance and development aid, which have helped to finance the expansion of higher education in Africa. As more countries, such as the then Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe, continue to offer African students scholarships to study in their countries, these countries, on the other hand, contribute personnel and resources to teach the languages and cultures within departments of modern languages in the African universities. Does this not smack of a new form of colonization? To conclude, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I am tempted to agree with one inspirational Pan-Africanist who rhetorically asked, how has slavery or colonization changed? And answers that nothing has changed except the location of our chains. Instead of fetters on our hands and legs, there are now chains on our minds and spirits. Thank you for your kind attention.